Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Robert Carter. Most of the faces here I recognize, some of you I haven't seen before, so welcome. I'm going to launch into a discussion on a very controversial figure in world history, a man named Charles Darwin, a man who was born in the late 1700s, lived throughout most of the 1800s. And if you think about it, contemporary-wise, Marxism, phrenology, that's the study of studying the bumps on your head to tell you what your personality was. Seances, Freudian psychology. There's an awful lot of pseudoscience hopping around in the world at that time. But also, Charles Darwin is a complicated figure. I mean, if we want to understand evolution, we have to understand him. But did you know that from the age of 29 until when he died in the 70s, he was housebound? He was agoraphobic. He had a mirror in his mansion because his older brother was supposed to inherit the land, but he was a drug addict, so they pensioned him off and gave him a little bit of money every month and said, "Get out of here." And Darwin inherits the family estate, and so he'd be sitting in his study, in his oak-paneled study, with his doors cracked, and he could look down the long hallway of his mansion, and there was a full-length mirror right next to the front door, and when the door opened, he could glance up, and if it was an unannounced visitor, he'd run away. He wrote this in his own diaries. Very interesting figure. And yet this man also contributed money to Wilberforce's anti-slavery campaign. Here's a man who thought Africans were subhuman, and yet he contributed financially to anti-slavery. What a complicated figure this is. We've got a lot to learn here. It's going to be a lot of fun. If you're not familiar with CMI, we do a lot of things. We have our gigantic website called Creationcom. I brought a selection of books and other things for you to peruse out there. We also produce Creation Magazine, the Journal of Creation. We've done several movies. We do a lot of videos on YouTube. We also have a weekly newsletter called Info Bites. It comes out every Friday. We'll identify something new or interesting in the world of science, something they're talking about right then. It's a big news splash, and we'll get an article written, and then we send it out to all of our people. And honestly, I can't even keep up with the amount of information that we're producing. But this helps me a lot, because every Friday I get a little summary. A couple articles. Oh, I forgot to read that one. I'll click on the thing and I'll go read the article. And it's really helpful to me, and I know it's helpful to other people also. If you'd like to get our newsletter, it's really simple. John here is going to hand out a little sign-up form. We ask for a name and email address and a zip code. And the zip code is there because every time we send a speaker on the road, we'll email everyone within a certain radius and say, "Hey, come on, bring a friend." Someone last night who came because of getting one of our emails. So that's there for you. No biggie. She's going to collect them again in a minute, so they're going around. My purpose here, though, is not to assassinate this man's character. He's a human being, and he deserves respect as a human being. If he did something right, he should be complimented, but if he did something wrong, it should be part of the public record. I'm not trying to destroy the reputation of Darwin, even though he deserves a lot of opprobrium. We're going to put it in the right place. The reason for doing this, though, is so that we can better understand the culture and the worldview of the people that we interact with. I ended the last talk with this, and we'll start talk today with this. 1 Peter 3:15. "In your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. You do it with gentleness and respect." I submit to you that if we understand this man, Charles Darwin, better, we're going to be able to better handle objections to Christianity. That's the goal. And I'm going to start off by saying that there are three things that Darwin did not know. That is, he did not know modern geology. He was basing his evolutionary theory on outdated views of geology. Things people don't believe anymore. He had no idea of modern biology, no clue whatsoever. And lastly, and most importantly, he did not know Jesus. There is no evidence of a Christian testimony in this man's life. In fact, he was surrounded by atheists. And he writes this. We know this. That's very important as far as the conclusions that he would ultimately draw. Well, coming from an upper-class family, his father was a society doctor. So his father was a doctor to a lot of rich people. His older brother was sent to study medicine at Edinburgh. And Darwin being the second son, well, Darwin, what are we going to do with you? Why don't you go study medicine also? But strangely, he could not stand the sight of blood. And this is prior to the invention of antibiotics, of anesthetics. Whatever. The things that put you to sleep from the doctor's office, by the way, that was invented by a Christian who read the account of God putting Adam to sleep when he operated on his rib. And he said, hey, why can't we do that? Ether. But that was after Darwin was in medical school. And what's also strange is he had an inordinate fondness for killing things. He wrote about his only passion as a young man was hunting. And it wasn't hunting for the sake of eating. He just liked killing things. There's an account in his diary. He's going around the Galapagos Islands with a hammer, and he's whacking birds on the head. Because they didn't fly away. What? You know, when a child today is abusive to an animal, the psychologists raise a giant red flag. They say, this person's going to be a mass murderer. It's a huge red flag when someone harms animals for no reason. And well, interestingly, Darwin did that a lot, but he gets to medical school and he basically fails out. So now what? The younger son? You're either going to be a soldier or a priest. That's your only two options at the moment. So he chose the priesthood. His dad sent him to Cambridge to study to become an Anglican vicar. This is the father of evolutionary biology here. This is very strange, but also strangely, his entire tenure at this college, he never once had to open the Bible. The Anglicans were training people to serve in their church with zero Bible knowledge. There's cultural knowledge of things, but no intense study. That was the future leadership, which is not a good thing. But he's done now. He never became a vicar. He never went to some parish. He's trained as a classic Victorian gentleman. Now that time, this is like the last time in history where you could have a pretty good understanding of most fields of knowledge at the same time. The amount of knowledge is exploding, but right here, 1820 something, you can have a pretty good grasp on almost everything that people were talking about. And that was Darwin. He could draw, he could write. He's a very good writer. A little laborious, repetitive, boring, but he knew his grammar. By the way, I've read almost everything that Darwin wrote. Not all of his letters, everything's online. You can read every book, every pamphlet, and all of his letters. He wrote thousands of letters back and forth. They called it the Society of Letters. It was like the upper crust of Europe had a parallel society and they were ignoring everybody else. It's very strange. He was in the middle of all that. So he was plugged into the system. All right, before I get there. Also, while he's growing up, while he was in college and before that, he had three very important people in his life. I'm going to call them his three tutors. First was his grandfather, who he never met. But have you ever heard that Charles Darwin invented the theory of evolution? You know that's not true, right? His grandfather wrote a book about evolution. The family coat of arms had, on the stripe across the middle, had 3 shells and a Latin phrase, all from shells. Now, his grandfather's book wasn't a science book, it was a book of poems. Because in the late 1700s, you could not write about evolution outwardly. So, he wrote a poetry book about evolution. Everybody knew that he believed that things evolved. In fact, Darwin said that he had entire passages of his grandfather's book memorized. He grew up in his household with an evolutionary phrase emblazoned on the coat of arms. He did not invent evolutionary theory. Another important man is a guy named Adam Sedgwick. Sedgwick was a very important early geologist, and not really a creationist. We would call him a catastrophist. He believed that there were periodic catastrophes in Earth's history, and the last one was the one that killed off the dinosaurs, and after that, God creates Adam and Eve. But he's got a pseudo-biblical approach here, and he names the Cambrian era. That's the earliest in the evolutionary record, the earliest place in the fossil record with multicellular organisms. Named after Cambria, the ancient name for Wales. And Darwin toured Wales with Sedgwick on the summer before he finishes at Cambridge. So he's done with college. Here's the future father of evolutionary biology. He's calling himself a geologist. It's weird, man. He's a hunter. He's a med school dropout. Now he's got a seminary degree, essentially, and he's calling himself a geologist. What a weird guy. Another very important man was a man named Charles Lyell. Now, he schooled Darwin through a book. When Darwin got on the HMS Beagle for his 5-year trip around the world, the captain, the future anti-Darwinist, Captain Fitzroy, gave Darwin a book, Lyell's Principles of Geology. Lyell used phrases like slow and gradual, count up the layers, count up the years. The present is the key to the past. Very important geological ideas from Lyell, but Lyell was a lawyer. He was a lawyer writing about geology using every lawyer's rhetorical trick you can possibly imagine. He puts it into this book. And he had a very strange view of geology. He thought that the continents slowly rose and continents slowly sank. That's why there's shells on top of continents. Because at one point the continents sank, and these clams were living, and the continents rose again. Now the clams are stuck. Nobody believes that anymore, but Darwin sucked in this book, and by the time he gets to South America, he's pretty much a Lyellian. I think Lyell's other 2 volumes of his work were delivered to Darwin while he was traveling, because he's in constant letter communication with people. He's collecting specimens and sending them back to England. He's writing letters back and forth. He's having packages delivered to him. And we get to a port that they already left. They send it to the next port. So when the ship got there finally, because it was a surveying boat, it took a long time to get places. They spent a long time surveying. And strangely, poor Darwin, he was always seasick while on board. By the way, have you ever heard that he was the ship's naturalist? That's not true. The doctor was the ship's naturalist. Darwin was the cabin boy. In Victorian society, classes couldn't mix. And the captain was upper class. He could not even have dinner with any of his sailors. He was going to be completely alone for years with a bunch of people who couldn't even talk to him. Morning, Captain. That's about all he could get. There couldn't be no conversation. So they looked around for someone who was upper class, who was willing to be basically a dinner companion for the captain. That was Charles Darwin. He was also the 3rd choice. The other 2 guys said no. At the last minute, they find Darwin and goes, "Oh, I'll do it." Which meant that here we had this very inquisitive mind, who's free of all responsibilities, and all he has to do is dress up and sit down at dinner with the captain. He has all the free time in the world. And like a kid in a candy store, he's going around the world. And, reading his journal of research is amazing, especially his book on coral reefs, because I'm a coral reef scientist. I'm imagining myself, on Tahiti, and looking at corals and the reef and all this stuff, and not having any idea how this stuff formed, and just imagining and coming up with these cool theories, and that's what he writes down. And he goes to this place. I've been here. We got a boat, we went around this, went through this. What is that? Give you a hint, it's in the Galapagos Islands. That is a volcano. All the Galapagos Islands are volcanoes. And all the islands also are sloped. High ground is in the north and low ground is in the south. They're tilted. Every island, big islands and even the little ones like this. Because all the weather in the Galapagos blows from the south. Rain always approaches from the south. So the south ends of islands get all the rain, the north ends are the deserts. And there's cloud forests in the Galapagos. There's giant trees and vines and wetness up high. And in the south, but on the north sides of all the islands, it's very desert-like. Well, he goes to Isla Tortuga, just like me, he goes in a ship and goes around it, and he imagines, what? This is a desert environment. Erosion is very slow. It must have taken millions of years to form these islands. But he was there during a La Nina cycle. Had he been there down during El Nino, he would have seen a lush and verdant landscape with lots of rain and lots of erosion. There are single storms that can blow through here and cause, 10,000 years worth of erosion in a single night. Because when you have a rainstorm on bare, sandy, rocky soil, there's no roots to hold it in, and stuff just washes away. But he's got in his mind this Lyell geology of slow and gradual. And the islands are slowly rising or slowly sinking. And it's slow and gradual, slow and gradual, slow and gradual. It's always thinking. He knew nothing about something like modern plate tectonics. Now, the continents definitely move. How fast they move is an open question. How fast they moved in the past is also an open question. And our preferred model is called catastrophic plate tectonics, which is developed by Dr. John Baumgartner. It's a brilliant idea that once you start plate tectonics, you get runaway tectonics. It's going to run for several years and then slow down and stop. And there's lots of computer modeling on that. Go to Creationcom, you can look at it if you like. Just catastrophic plate tectonics. But today, we don't have continents rising and sinking. We have continents smashing into each other, and those horizontal movements is what pushes things up or pushes things down. In fact, Darwin was right here. That's where the Galapagos Islands are, right at the intersection of those three plates. And one of the plates is being pushed under and melting and bubbling back up again. But Darwin also went somewhere about here. And he got to the Santa Cruz River. And he had the sailors row him 110 miles upstream. No, he didn't do any rowing, of course not. The sailors rowed him 110 miles. And they ran out of food, and they came back. He was trying to cross the continent. Just like the Straits of Magellan, at the bottom of South America, you can cross over. He said, oh, this is going to cross over. So he tried to cross it. Dude, you're going uphill. Rivers don't do that, right? Anyway, he didn't get as far as this glacier. The Perito Moreno Glacier in Argentina, it used to be over probably a mile higher than it is now. So the height of the Ice Age, it was a massive glacial wall. And as it started to melt, a giant lake built up behind it. And eventually the glacier failed, and a giant wash of water raced 200 miles to the sea and caused a giant canyon through hard rock. And yet Darwin, looking at these rocks, not knowing what was upstream, said, no evidence, no action of any flood could possibly have carved these rocks. That's a direct quote. Today, geologists, secular geologists, think that this river valley was caused by a gigantic flood coming from this glacier. Neat. This is an idea called catastrophism. Lyell completely discounted catastrophism. He would have none of it. Modern geologists have been forced to conclude there's lots of catastrophes that have happened in Earth's history. They don't call themselves uniformitarianists anymore. They call themselves actualists. Whatever actually happened, that's what happened. So yeah, there's a big meteor strike, or a big flood or something, and then millions of years later, another one happened. And so you can have a fossil layer, a gap of millions of years, and then another layer. But it's neo-catastrophism coming back into geology. Darwin also didn't understand anything about sedimentation. He's looking at a Grand Canyon, but he never saw this, but he's looking at rock layers around the world, and he has no clue of how they're formed. It used to be that geologists thought that something like the White Cliffs of Dover, right, a couple 100 feet, mainly coccolithophore shells, tiny little calcium carbonate shells produced by this little alga. There's a massive deposit of coccolithophore shells. Well, one of those shells would take about 100 years to settle from the surface to the bottom of the ocean, even the shallow ocean. They're so small. You can look at them under a microscope, they wiggle, because water molecules are bumping into them, making them wiggle. They take a very long time. And if we're depending upon slow and gradual, well, that's a great model. These things settle very slowly, take millions of years to accumulate on the bottom. Of course, why is there no volcanic ash in there? Why are there no fish bones? Why are there no sea snails? Those are great questions, indicating that it did not take that long. But modern geologists, in fact, there's two guys, McWecker and Bohax, they write this article in Science magazine on the accumulation of mud. They wrote a paper in the most prestigious journal in the world on mud. Why? Because like 2/3 of the rock record is mud. Shale, limestone, mudstone. Most of the rock record is muddy stuff that has turned into stone. And so explaining it is very important. But what they realize is that even fine particles floating in water, if you shake the water, give it a little turbulence, the particles will stick together and form a larger particle, which flocculates out very quickly. So now instead of slow and gradual, count up the layers, count up the years, they're saying, oh, you could have a gigantic muddy suspension in water, and all of a sudden the mud goes and just falls out and makes a giant layer on the bottom. And then looking at flume studies. On the left is a graduated cylinder. The scientist, as actually creation scientist, he took white and black sand and mixed it together. So it's gray. And he just pours the mixture into the water. And as it's falling through the water, it spontaneously separates into laminations. Why? And then he has a flume. He's got a raceway of water. And the water's running down. He's pouring the sand into the flume and letting it accumulate on the bottom. And he's varying the speed of the water. And he's getting horizontal bands, and he's getting these diagonal bands. But this diagonal band, that means that this layer, and this middle layer, and this layer here were all being laid down at the same time. Not like this, like this. Multiple layers can be laid down simultaneously? Yeah. And consider something like the asphalt layer at Mount St. Helens. May of 1980, that was a month later, it's June of 1980. A gigantic wall of steam and volcanic ash came racing down this mountain and deposited like a 15-foot thick layer. This is not slow and gradual count up the layers. This is volcanic ash is falling out of the sky, spontaneously forming laminated sediments. Well, if we can make laminated sediments quickly, then all the laminated sediments in the world are not necessarily evidence of millions of years. In fact, we get to reinterpret a lot of that because of what we learned in geology over just the last 10 or 20 years. Things Darwin had no clue of. He also did not understand the process of fossilization. In The Origin of Species, he writes, no organism wholly soft can be preserved. Why? Because he thought that the sediments only accumulate slowly. So if something soft dies, it would rot away long before it has a chance to be buried and petrified. So you should never find fossilized jellyfish, or more fossilized jellyfish, or more fossilized jellyfish, or more fossilized jellyfish, or fossilized worms, or fossilized flowers. I mean, we have all of these soft things that we found fossilized. And every time we find something like that, that is an indication that that object or that organism was buried and petrified quickly. Because soft things rot very quickly. And throughout the entire fossil record, we're finding all these things that totally contradict Darwin's views of fossilization. I said this yesterday, and I'll say it again for those of you that weren't there. His biology is also questionable because in order to get evolution, you have to apply a philosophy to biology. I am a biologist. I have a PhD in biology. I study living organisms. I love studying living organisms. I totally geek out. I'm very glad I've dedicated my life to this. There's no end of amazement, but I'm not an evolutionist. If you take the study of living things and apply a philosophy called naturalism, that is, nature's all there is. That is, you can use natural processes to explain everything that's ever happened in the entire universe. and only natural processes, and you're not allowed to appeal to any sort of God or miracle. That's called naturalism. If you apply naturalism to biology, you're going to get evolution, and that's how Darwin derived it. He started with a philosophy, a giant assumption, and ends up with a completely theoretically mechanistic way to explain the origin of all diversity of all life on Earth. No, I believe in God. I'm a theist. If you take theism as a belief in God and apply that to biology, you're going to get some form of creation. The various different forms of creation, depending upon your approach. I got that. But just reading the Bible straightforward, it sure does read like the Bible's claiming there's no common ancestry between man and monkeys, because Adam was made out of dust of the ground, directly contradicting naturalistic ideas. It sure does read like God created all living things to reproduce within specific different kinds. It sure does read like this all happened about 6,000, maybe 6,200 years ago. That's what the Bible reads, and again, that's philosophy, and I understand that. But evolutionary biology is also squarely based on philosophy. And we all need to understand that. They talk like they're very matter of fact. But no, really, they're talking philosophy. Darwin also knew nothing about the cell. At the time, he thought the cell was a bag of salts. They called it protoplasm. Early, I think plasm is seed. Early life. Wow. Today we call cytoplasm. Because the protoplasm idea was the thought that there's this magical substance called protoplasm, which is in all things. It has sort of like a life essence or a life force to it, and it's driving evolution. It's really mystical. This is what he and his contemporaries were thinking. And so you get this protoplasm, which is just kind of salty stuff. And if the cell turns a square, or turns into a circle, or turns purple, or grows a spike, okay, whatever. If you think the cell is really simple, you can imagine anything happening to it. And if it's simple, you can change it easily. But today, we understand that the cell is incredibly complex, and it's highly engineered, and it is absolutely amazing. It's nothing like a simple cell. In fact, even saying simple cell, you're talking about bacteria, that's ridiculous. They are the most amazing things you can imagine, because we don't understand them. They're so complicated. He also knew nothing about biochemistry. And that keeps going and going and going. Biochemistry will make your brain spin. And every single one of these chemicals that you see is connected by an arrow to another chemical, and along the arrow is the name of a protein, a machine that is designed to go from one complicated and improbable molecule to another complicated and also improbable molecule. Biological molecules don't exist in random chemical reactions. Biological molecules, they don't happen by themselves. Some of the simpler ones, like amino acids, yeah, sure, okay, fine. But we're talking about things with highly reactive systems and things that cross-react with each other. And if you throw these biological molecules into a pool, you're going to get tar. They're just going to react. You can't get living things out of that. He also knew nothing about the complexity of life, and we're just starting to uncover this. I'm showing you here a map of what's called the interactome. You know what the genome is? It's the sum of all your genes. You also have a proteome, which is all your proteins. You have an interactome, which is just a list of all the interactions of all the proteins in your body. The map here, in green, the little dots are proteins. The green area is the nucleus. The blue area is the cytoplasm. The yellow area is the membrane-bound proteins and extracellular proteins. And you can see there's a square there, and a zoom up, another square, and another zoom up. And by the time you get to here, that one protein in the middle there, it's connected to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 other proteins, I think. And that's only about a third of the proteins that they found. If they showed all of them, you just see nothing but lines. It's like this. Like, let's say that that is that central protein. It's going to interact with other proteins. How? Well, there's another protein that comes and grabs onto it. There's another protein that comes and cuts the label off and replaces it. There's another protein that comes and opens up the cap. Another protein that does that. There's another protein that places the cap on it. There's another protein that goes like that so it can't be used. And they're very specific, because the protein that grabs onto it has to fit into these little grooves here. You change the shape of that protein, it doesn't work anymore. So we're talking about multiple lock and key mechanisms that operate in 3 dimensions. They fit, they're perfectly designed, and they mutually interact with each other. How does something like that evolve? I mean, a simple system, this plus that does that, okay, fine. But if this, and that, and they all do something together, and if none of them work and you don't get that, what on earth? This is complexity. There's only a scratching the surface of complexity. The human interactome is at least 10 times more complicated than that of a fruit fly, especially in the brain. And yet, if you break these links, like let's say you mess this protein up and it doesn't work anymore, you're probably going to kill the fruit fly. There are a couple of things you can change. That'll change the wing shape, the eye color, the size of the fruit fly, the number of hairs on his face, whatever. A couple of things you can change, but most of the possible changes are deadly. Oh, so things can change. That's true. But if you exceed the design specifications of an organism, it dies. Because organisms are engineered with a wonderful tolerance code, and a lot of error checking and redundancy mechanisms, to the point where, yeah, if you need this thing to be open and the water to come out, and something breaks and this one doesn't work, there might be another way in a biochemical pathway to generate what you need. It won't be an efficient system, but you can still survive, even though you're a step down. It's called redundancy. God built a lot of redundancy into life on purpose because he's a good engineer. Darwin also did not understand how fast species can form. Not all. In fact, it's pretty shocking how fast species can form. There's 2 people, Peter and Rosemary Grant. I met these people. They're delightful people. Lovely, wonderful, old college professor types. When we filmed a film called Darwin, the Voyage Shook the World in 2009. It was in honor of Charles Darwin's 200th birthday. And we asked the Grants if they could be interviewed. And they said, no, we're going to be in the Galapagos. Because they've spent 30 or 40 years, every season they go to this one little island, which you can see from the airport as you're landing. It's right over there, Daphne Minor. And they've tagged every bird on that island every year. And they've watched them mate, and now they do genetic studies. And their book, How and Why Species Multiply, reads like a creationist book. And then they appeal to millions of years, of course. But they showed that a species can form in a single season. They watched it happen. A bird, who himself was a hybrid, flew onto this island. He was larger than the other birds. And somehow we found a mate, and they raised a clutch of eggs. But birds, the female birds, are listening to the song of their father. And when they go try to find a mate, they listen for a male that sings like their father does. The males are listening to the song of their father, and when they grow up, they'll sing like their father. And so this group of birds, they grew up, and the females couldn't find any other males to mate with except their brothers. And they intermated. One of them flew away and mated with another a small ground fish, I don't remember what it was, another species of bird, fine. But that clutch of eggs, they grew up. There have never been a lot of them, a few dozen, but they've been there for like 30 years now. And they only mate within themselves. They have a different song, they look different, and they act different, they eat different things. So all the definitions of what you would call a species. There are other times, they've been there long enough, they've gone through several El Nino, La Nina cycles. And during El Nino, when everything is wet, these birds hybridize like crazy. Different species, all intermating. During the dry years, the intermediate birds tend to die out, and the specialist birds tend to live. So you get speciation, disappearing species. Speciation, disappearing species. Speciation. We don't know what a species is anymore, and all Darwin's ideas about species, forget it. He was talking about stuff he had no idea of. He thought it took millions of years to form a species through natural selection. Hybridization forms more species than anything else. No idea how fast species would interbreed. In fact, evolutionists have been resisting this thought for a long time. Finally, a couple years ago, Elizabeth Pennisi, who writes a lot of things for science, she wrote this article called Shaking Up the Tree of Life. And she lists all these cases of hybridization, successful hybridization, not like a mule, a successful hybridization between two different species. And they're saying, oh yeah, so you have kingdom, family, class, order, family, genus, species. You have many times species with the same genus, many times class, order, family, many species in the same family, different genera can interbreed. And they're finding cases of species within the same class, order, the same order. They're supposedly, they've been supposedly separated by 30 million years or so. Like the sturgeon and called the sturble fish. What's the other? Sturgeon and Ertle. It's a fish that ends in Ertle. It's an ugly thing, looks like a dinosaur fish. They call it a living fossil. Anyway, they just found hybrids of these things, and they supposedly have been separated for like hundreds of millions of years. That can't be true. I took these photos on the Galapagos. On the left, Darwin called that the imp of darkness. It's the marine iguana. They're very good climbers. They swim out into the cold waters. They eat seaweed from rocks. They swim back, they climb out the surf cold with their great, big, strong claws, and they sit in the sun. So most of the day, they're just sitting in the sun warming up, and go forage a little bit, get cold, and come back to the rocks again. On the right, that is a land iguana. We're told that these things have been separated for like 3 million years. Just for context, when I was in graduate school even, they were saying that humans and chimpanzees have been separated for about 3 million years. Today they say 6 to 6.5, but we're talking about several million years. In the evolutionary model, these guys have been separated. They're very different, they look different, they act different, they live in different places, and because of the time that they've been separated, no one expected them to be able to hybridize. But the first time a graduate student went out to look for hybrids, he found them on the first island that he looked at. And the hybrid is superior to both the parents. Because the land iguana can't climb worth anything. It just sits under the cactus, waiting for a cactus flower to fall. And then it constantly eats it. The hybrids are great climbers. They climb up the cactus, right over the giant thorns, and eat whatever they want. What's a species? I have no idea. And since we don't know about what a species is, Darwin's origin of species, what does it even mean? Nobody knows anymore. On the top left there is someone took a dog and made it with a wolf, and then let the puppies interbreed also. And they came out with a mutt, a lab, a wolf, and a shaggy DA. That's crazy. Wolves and dogs are the same species. There's a coy dog. It's a coyote dog hybrid. There's some guy wrote a book called Living with Wolf Dogs. If I wrote that book, it'd be like Living with Wolf Dogs by Dr. Robert Carter. Page 1, not recommended. The end. The Russians needed a dog that could sniff for drugs at the big international airport in Moscow. And huskies, which are good cold-tolerant dogs, they have a lousy sense of smell. There's not much to smell in the Arctic, right? So they don't have a good sense of smell. So we need a cold-tolerant dog that can smell. Oh, let's go breed it with an African jackal. But what? Jackals are dogs? And sure enough, the Sulamov dog, which they use in their drug task force at Sheremetyevo Airport in Moscow, is 1/4 jackal and 3/4 husky. It can smell great at 20 below zero. Dogs, wolves, coyotes, African jackals, one species. According to the biological species concept, if two things can interbreed, they're the same species. So now we're talking about the biblical idea, dogs are one created kind. A lot of genetic diversity thrown in. Darwin also missed on that. Oh, good, I'm looking at how long my computer's been turned on. Now, I got 11 minutes. Yes, okay. I can't do it in 11 minutes, but I'll try. There's too much cool stuff to say. Unknown to most people, Darwin did not invent evolution while on the Galapagos Islands. You go online, who invented evolution? I mean, there'll be 100 websites that Charles Darwin thought of the concept of evolution by natural selection while touring the Galapagos. That's an urban myth. He even wrote in his journal. It never occurred to me that the productions of islands, only a few miles apart and placed under the same physical conditions, would be dissimilar. I therefore did not attempt to make a series of specimens from the separate islands. What he's trying to do, he's trying to fix his own record. He made a giant mistake. When he was collecting birds, he's a geologist, remember, he's not a biologist yet. He's collecting birds, he's sending them back to England, the taxonomists at the museum, to look at. And when he gets back, they said, hey, these things are good species. What island did you collect them from? I don't know. They used Captain Fitzroy's collection, the Christian, the future anti-Darwinist, his collection of birds, to sort out Darwin's collection of birds, so we can now call them Darwin's finches. Because he didn't see it. He even wrote, the governor of these islands, Mr. Lawton, tells me that he can tell from which island any of the giant tortoises come from just based on the shape of the shell. And right after that he says something like, and I did not believe him. So look at these two tortoises. This one has a saddleback. This is sloped. They're very different shells. They live on different volcanoes. Each of the main volcanoes, even on the big islands, has a species of tortoise. Because the females don't ever come down. They stay up on the top. The males range a little bit. So you have this isolation of these tortoises on the islands. And yet, I took these photos at the giant tortoise breeding facility. And they were trying to save some species. And I said, sir, how do you save a species when there's only one of them left? Oh, we crossbreed them with another species. Thank you, sir. That's all I need to know. Darwin also didn't know that his tree of life idea would be falsified. This famous Darwin notebook, he writes, this is a couple decades before he writes The Origin of Species. He writes, I think. And he draws this branching diagram. And every time it ends in a branch that doesn't have a letter, that's an extinct organism, and the letters are living organisms. That's the first tree of life we've ever seen. So people have this concept. Start with the primordial life, and it diversifies into all living things today. Now, this is more like it. If you try to draw a tree of life using genetics, you're going to get a bird's nest. There's no clear tree of life in the genes. So their evolutionists say, oh yeah, well that's because of horizontal gene transfer. Those early organisms, as new genes are evolving, the DNA will be stolen by another species. You get horizontal change. That's why there's no clear pattern of evolution. Now, the creationists have introduced a term called the creationist forest. The idea that God created distinct groups of organisms separate from one another, designed to reproduce within the groups only, and the ability to diversify over time. I've expanded that. A series of articles I wrote appeared on Creationcom last summer. Species were designed to change. I introduced a concept which I really like. In fact, I'm going to present this at the Creation Research Society conference this summer. A whole lecture just on this. God would have created more than two individuals in each species, each kind. Yes, he created two human beings. He doesn't say anything about how many elephants or oak trees or bacteria he created. I'm imagining gazillions of E. coli's. Tons and tons of oak trees. But that means that he could have filled those organisms with lots of genetic diversity. And in this case, in the bottom there, if you had maybe a kind that's broken up into discrete populations, each little population with its own little genetic pool, As they, over time, going upwards, some of them might merge, some of them might remain separate. Then at the flood, most of them are going to die, and a few remaining ones that survive are going to repopulate the earth again. So you can get an ebb and flow in the created kinds, because God could put a lot of genetic diversity into each kind. He could even have put a lot of genetic diversity into Adam and Eve. But if you add the thought that there's, I don't know, quadrillions of E. coli in the world at creation, that's a lot of potential diversity. Darwin also didn't know what selection can and cannot do. John Sanford and I wrote a paper. We published this in Theoretical Biology and Medical Modeling. It's an evolutionary journal. All we did was look at the H1N1 influenza virus. Going back to the earliest samples, some lady died in Alaska in 1918 of the flu, and in North Alaska, they buried her body in permafrost. So scientists went, dug up the body, took the tissue sample, and sequenced the flu genome, which is rather dangerous, but it gave us a starting point for the epidemic. And we looked at thousands of other flu genomes up and through 2009, when it went extinct. In fact, the evolutionists didn't know that the H1N1 went extinct. We pointed out to them. And we just counted up the number of differences from 1918, and we saw the straightest line I've ever seen in my scientific career. I couldn't believe it. The influenza virus is under strong natural selection. It is at war with the human genome, the human immune system. Only those viruses that can escape the immune system are passed to the next generation. That makes sense, right? So there should be a tremendous amount of culling of bad mutations in that virus. And what we saw was a continual accumulation, more and more and more mutations over time, until it finally went extinct when about 12% of the genome had mutated. So yeah, natural selection works. Natural selection can focus on a couple of things, but most mutations are silent, and natural selection can't see them, so they don't get removed. That's about the same number of generations of the virus as supposedly separates humans from chimpanzees, by the way. We've been accumulating mutations since we were created. We are doomed to extinction. Of course, Jesus is going to come back before humans go extinct. We know that. But in science, there's no hope for humanity. There's no hope for any species because of the accumulation of genetic mutations. But Darwin knew nothing about DNA. He knew nothing about genetics. Evolution is all about genetics. He knew nothing about how traits are passed from one generation to the next. He didn't know this thing called DNA, which he thought was just basically a phosphorus bag inside the cell, was going to become as complicated as we know. Oh, there's three-dimensional considerations, four-dimensional considerations. There's all these crazy things that I'm going to have to skip over because I'm going to end up with this. I'm going to read to you some quotes from Darwin. These are designed to turn your stomach. This is not politically correct. I am not advocating this, but this is historical record. And this should make you angry. He writes in his book, The Descent of Man. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man, which he meant Europeans, will almost certainly exterminate or replace the savage races throughout the world, which he meant brown and black people. He wasn't sure what to do with Chinese people, but they were still below Europeans, just not that much below. At the same time, the anthropological apes will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest ally will then be wider, for it will intervene between man and a more civilized state, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of now between the Negro or Australian and a gorilla. How convenient that he thought he was at the top of the evolutionary chain. But he was also saying that for evolution to progress, you have to kill off all the black people, because they are inferior to the white people. So Adam Sedgwick, remember him from earlier? He writes Darwin a letter a month after the Origin of Species is published. I've read your book with more pain than pleasure. parts I read with absolute sorrow, because I think them utterly false and grievously mischievous. You deserted the true method of induction. Ouch! And in this part in Cedric's letter, he's talking about the link between the physical and the spiritual. The age-old, the deus ex machina. Is there a ghost in the machine, or are we just a machine? Okay, all you children of the 80s, remember the Police album? Ghost in the machine, we are spirits in the material world, our spirits. That's the question, this age-old question. Is there a ghost or are we just a machine? He writes, were it possible, which thank God it is not, to break the link between the physical and the spiritual. Humanity, my mind, would suffer damage that might brutalize it and sink the human race into a lower grade of degradation than any into which it has fallen since the written records tell us of its history. He just predicted the history of the 20th century, where more people died at the hands of atheistic governments than had ever died at the hands of any government before. I'm going to skip over a little more, because we have to end with the last point, that Darwin did not know Jesus. His mother, his wife, he married a Wedgwood, by the way. It was his first cousin. The Wedgwood pottery family, they're all Unitarians. His wife was a Unitarian, his mother was a Unitarian, his father and grandfather called themselves free thinkers. He called himself an agnostic after Thomas Huxley invented the term. But when you read his writing, there's no evidence of any understanding of real Christian theology. He uses flowery language because the culture had used it, but when you read it, it's nothing. And very importantly, he did not recant on his deathbed. That's an urban myth that a lot of people believe. Yeah, there's a letter we got from a lady named Lady Hope. She was an evangelist in the 1800s. She said, I visited Charles Darwin in the fall of the year while he was on his deathbed, even in the spring. And it gets worse from there. She claims that he recanted, but there's no actual evidence for that, because we have his letters going back and forth up to just right before he died. And he writes in his autobiography, thus disbelief crept over me at a very slow rate. What was at last complete? The rate was so slow that I felt no distress and never since doubted, even for a second, that my conclusion was correct. I can indeed hardly see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true. For if so, the plain language of the text seems to show that men who do not believe, this to include my father, brother, and almost all of my friends, will be everlastingly punished. And this is, pardon my French, damnable doctrine. If you don't think this is a spiritual battle, open your eyes. The father of evolutionary biology called Christianity damnable. This is not about science. There are spiritual things, deep and dark spiritual things happening here. I'm going to leave you with one more quote and ask one more question. A man who has no assured and ever-present belief in the existence of a personal God, or a future existence with retribution and reward as hell and heaven, can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest or which seem to him the best ones. That's called hedonism. Welcome to America, my friends. Why do you think we're seeing hedonistic impulses everywhere in our society? Because it derives from philosophical underpinnings and conclusions one draws from evolutionary theory. All right, final question. If Darwin were alive today, knowing everything we know, would he still come up with evolutionary theory? I see two different answers. Shaking heads and right. That's funny. Would he? A lot of the younger professors today, growing up in this technological understanding, they're turning to things like Gaia. The universe is alive. There's universal consciousness. Emergent complexity, that somehow in the mathematics of the universe, complex things just spontaneously appear. Or aliens did it. So the first two are very religious, and the third one is called intelligent design. So would Darwin have come up with it? I'm not sure, but I do know, according to Romans 8:7, the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. And that's what we see in the progression of Charles Darwin's life. A little hat tip to Christianity early on, completely rejecting it by the end, and the thing that he devised as a replacement is hostile to God. It's not about science. It's about a spiritual battle that is raging all around us. That's all I have for you this morning. I hope that was okay. Sorry it was a little long, but I have too much to say. Let's pray and we can dismiss. Father, we are stuck in a culture that hates you, and yet we know that there are people here that want to find an escape from the cycle of hatred. We know that there are people right outside these walls that you've been working on, and they just need a little nudge. So use us, Lord. Use us to impact this little cultural event we're having right now. Help us to be mindful of the fact that this is a spiritual debate, and there's dark, demonic forces shrouding some of the people that we're going to run up into. And there might be some hostility, but it's okay, because we know you're going to work through us. We're trusting that. And we're also asking you, help us to work for you today. Be mindful of the worldview battle that's happening, to understand where they're coming from so that we can maybe just head them off the path.